Hey guys, it's Quintus, and today we're talking about the passives that apply while you're in werewolf form, and what we just get for being werewolves in general. Our strengths, our weaknesses, and all that. So let's jump right in. We're going to start with the basic stuff. What buffs do we get? What debuffs do we get for being a werewolf while we're in werewolf form? Well, for being in werewolf form, you just get 30% more stam, 18% more weapon damage, 30% more movement speed, 15% more stam recovery, and because of our passives that we get off of our abilities, we also just get Major Resolve, which is more resists, Major Brutality, which is more weapon damage, and Major Savagery for more crit rating. That's baked in. For just being a werewolf, you just get those. We also have a very easy access to Minor Courage, Major Berserk, and minor fortitude or in endurance. Those are things that we can get relatively easy depending on what morph you choose. Pretty much every werewolf ever will have minor courage for the extra weapon damage, usually. We also just have a very simple kit with simple rotations. That is one of the big strengths of werewolf is it's not really hard to play. It's a 1-bar skill line, and you don't even get an ultimate. You get 5 buttons and 5 buttons only. As far as weaknesses goes, we take 25% more damage from poison attacks. That sucks, especially things like Toxic Barrage. Even things like, I believe, some Subterranean Assault tend to sting a good bit. We also take 20% extra damage from Fighters Guild abilities. Now, this always gets brought up as, hey, they take so much more damage from Fighters Guild abilities. I tend to disagree with this a little bit. Dawnbreaker hurts everybody, but the passive that says that you take 20% more damage from Fighters Guild abilities is in the Fighters Guild line. And it basically says all your Fighters Guild abilities do 10% more damage, or twice that bonus against werewolves. So really, you're taking 10% more damage from these abilities than a normal person would take. Yes, you're technically taking 20% more, but everyone else is already taking 10% more already, so it's 10% more. Our abilities are pricey. Werewolf skills tend to be pretty darn expensive, so you're going to burn through your resources pretty quick. While you're in werewolf form, you cannot stealth. You are not allowed to stealth. You can't crouch. You just can't do it. A couple of considerations for PvE and PvP here. For PvE, you can't bar swap. This matters for certain encounters. In Cloud Rest, there is a mechanic that makes you bar swap. Now, as far as I know, that mechanic shouldn't tag you by default. But from what I understand, if other players die to it, it can spread to you and still cause you to die. I believe I have died to this in Cloud Rest before. So if there's a mechanic that requires you to bar swap, you can't do it without dropping form, that is. Our werewolf timer can suck. There's certain cutscenes, certain breaks inside of raids and dungeons where you're just not going to be able to maintain your timer by fighting and eating and devouring because there's just not going to be anything there. So werewolf timer is going to be a weakness for everything, really. And we do the damage that we do can be decent, especially for how easy our rotation is. But the trade-off for that is our parses are going to be significantly lower than a lot of other classes can achieve. There's a lot of classes out there right now that can achieve 110, 120,000 DPS. Werewolf, at its peak, with perfect rotation, perfect skills, perfect everything, can push upwards to 100, but breaking 100 isn't really realistic without an act of God, luck, and probably macros, if we're being honest. As far as PvP goes, we have a couple weaknesses there that aren't obvious as well, that don't get brought up a lot. One, we don't have a root break, other than breaking it ourselves. And remember, our skills are already really expensive. So having to break every piece of CC that hits you sucks. We don't get things like Race Against Time or any of those other skills that we could use to keep us moving and keep us going. We don't really have a heal over time. Yes, we have an ability that Claws of Life that does give us a little bit of heal over time if you hit a bunch of stuff with it, but it's kind of negligible in PvP. It's good in PvE, but in PvP, it's not really all that good. Timer again. I'm gonna keep bringing up timer. Timer is a weakness that we have. If we're not in the middle of fighting, it's hard to maintain. We can't deploy siege. You can use siege if it's set up for you. You can repair doors. You can do things like that while in werewolf form, but you cannot drop oil. Dropping oil is a bad way to put it. You can't deploy oil. You can't deploy ballistas, but if the oil and ballista, for example, are already set up, you can use them. You can drop the oil on your opponents. You can use the ballista to shoot a door, whatever. You also can't pack them up. It's important to know. So those are like the big positives and negatives for being a werewolf, just as a brief overview. Okay, let's talk about passives and how they apply to werewolf. In this section, we're going to be talking about class passives, because a lot of them don't apply, but some do, and they tend to be important. We're going to be talking about weapon passives, armor passives, all those other passives. What actually helps you in werewolf form? Let's start with the one that I think a lot of werewolves get wrong, and that is weapon passives. By weapon passives, I mean when you go to a weapon skill line, let's say you are using a two-hander, for example, the passives such as heavy weapons, that says grants a bonus based on the type of weapon you have equipped. Swords give weapon and spell damage, axes increase your crit damage, etc. Those don't count while you're in werewolf. You don't count as having those weapons equipped. So any of those passives that give you damage or crit or anything do not apply while you're in werewolf. Additionally, any skill that says while slotted gain X and it is not a werewolf skill does not work while you are in werewolf form. So if you have a passive from mage, the mage's guild that says, hey, you get more mana for having things slotted, or a particular skill that says, you take less damage while this is slotted, but it's not a werewolf skill. The moment you turn into werewolf, all of those turn off. You do not gain any of those while you're in werewolf form. It's important to note that weapon traits, weapon glyphs, and poisons do work while you are in werewolf form. Armor passives, however, tend to universally work. Any of the passives that you have in those skill lines, for example, light armor giving you penetration, medium armor giving you reduced cost in, say, dodging, heavy armor giving you more hit points, any of those passives tend to work. So for the most part, armor passives are all good. Now, guild passives are going to be a little bit stickier. For the most part, guild passives aren't going to help you because, again, most of them require you to have those skills slotted. There are exceptions. The Undaunted passives, for example, are good for everybody. They do apply while you're in werewolf form. As far as other combat ones, there's not a whole lot that actually helps you out here. Okay, now let's talk about class passives. Class passives might seem like they're random as to which ones apply and which ones don't, but I think it really comes down to whether or not the passive requires you to have one of the abilities from that skill line slotted. So which ones do work when we're in werewolf? I'm going to go over them here class by class. I'm going to try to be brief, and I'm going to be displaying them on screen in case you want to pause to get the exact wording or figure out exactly how these work. But in general, I'm just going to go over them as briefly as I can. Sorcerer gets the most passives that apply to werewolf. They get more damage, they deal more damage based on their amplitude and energized passives, which is really, really nice. They get extra recoveries and sustain off of their capacitor, unholy knowledge, and persistence passives. And they reduce the cost of their ultimate ability with their Power Stone passive, which is really nice. Transforming into werewolf is an ultimate ability. So this is a fantastic class for that. They get a lot of things going for them. Especially if you're trying to parse the extra damage passives are probably the best you can get from a class of passives specifically. Necromancers get a passive that lets them do extra damage with damage over time effects with Rapid Rot, especially good for Berserker Bleeds. They get extra health from Last Gasp. They get extra healing that they can deal when they with their Curative Curse passive, which is really nice. With our Howls, we're constantly healing ourselves, and they can generate ultimate with Corpse Consumption. This is a little brief aside. This isn't a passive, but they also get an ability called Necrotic Potency that is especially good for getting a lot of ultimate really quickly. So if you're trying to get into werewolf form quickly, Necromancers, even though they don't get a reduction to the ultimate cost, make up for that with some of their passives and abilities. Warden also get a passive that lets them generate ultimate. It is not incredible, but it's definitely not bad. Any help we can get getting into form is definitely nice. They get a passive that makes it so whenever they heal themselves or an ally, they get minor toughness, increasing their max health by 10%, which is also very, very nice. They also get a passive to reduce the effectiveness of snares, which if you ever played a werewolf, snares are no fun and definitely suck. So this is a nice little passive, and it increases their magic They can increase their magic and frost damage by 10%. This is kind of a nothing burger. We don't really do that kind of damage unless we're using glyphs on our weapons or something like that. So there's that. Templars are pretty great. They reduce the cost of their abilities. They can resurrect faster. They increase their weapon damage and spell damage while also getting physical and spell resist. And they have a passive, like most classes do, to generate some ultimate while they're outside of werewolf form. Templars are a pretty strong choice, pretty well-rounded. Dragoknights don't get a lot unless you want to specifically make your weapon glyphs like fire and poison. They get combustion, which gives them more sustain based on whether or not they can apply burning or poison status effects to their enemy. They get Word of Ruin, which increases those kinds of damage. So that's kind of nice. Otherwise, if you're not using weapon passives, using poisons, you're not really going to be able to benefit off of these inside of werewolf form. Otherwise, you get physical and spell resistance as one of your passives. You can block an additional 10% damage if you're a werewolf that likes to block. That's it. Dragoknights are fairly tanky, and they're probably pretty good outside of werewolf form, but in werewolf form, you're not really getting a lot of benefit for being a Dragonknight. Nightblades get some extra damage and some decent sustain. They're a reasonable choice. They get extra spell and physical and spell penetration against enemies that they're flanking. This does go against your Howl of Agony playstyle. You want to be facing them, but when you're not, because sometimes people are running away, you do get that extra penetration, which is really nice. You also get an ability that whenever an enemy dies near you, you get more sustain or some more resources back. You get 15% better sustain recoveries, which are really, really nice. And whenever you drink a potion, you gain ultimate. So these are the passives that apply as far as class skills or class passives go. So by combining all this, if you're someone who likes to min-max, these are the things that you want to consider as to, whether or not you want to play a sorcerer or a warden or a necromancer or whatever. I personally like sorcerers, necromancers, and templars a good bit for werewolves, but there's really not a wrong choice. And ultimately, you should pick the one that you enjoy the most outside of werewolf form. So that's it, guys. That is my brief but not brief passives overview. I hope this is helpful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to hit me up either here in the comments or in game. And as always, keep hunting.